that there is an enormous amount of waste and fraud and abuse in this government. There is no question to my mind that Congress has not been vigilant enough in rooting out that waste and fraud to the tune of billions and billions of dollars. I would simply say that while it is absolutely appropriate to condemn the Congress, it is also important to note that we have an administration in this city, in Washington, D.C., and the function of an administration is to administer. And that means that when there is waste and fraud, you have an administration who should also be on top of that situation. And I think of the many failings of the Bush administration, which in my view will go down in history as one of the worst in our country's history, clearly their overall incompetence will be one of those areas that people will focus on. And the second point that I would make, I see my friend from Oklahoma has left, is he is absolutely right that a $9.2 trillion national debt is unsustainable. But one of the areas that I don't believe he mentioned in terms of driving up that national debt is the war in Iraq. Now, we can have a great debate about the wisdom of that war. I voted against it when I was in the House. I think we should bring our troops home as soon as possible. But right now, we're not on the war, we're on the budget. And the question regarding the budget is, for all of those people who support the war, why don't you pay for the war now rather than forcing our kids and grandchildren to pay to the tune of $150 billion a year? And some say that this cost of this war eventually will run into the trillions of dollars. So all of those people who talk about fiscal irresponsibility refuse not to pay for the war. I was just reading a book about Dwight David Eisenhower, and in the book it points out that during the Korean War, Truman imposed a surtax on people's personal income tax and an excessive profits tax in order to pay for the war. I don't see the advocates of the war in Iraq coming forward and say, we don't want to leave that burden of $150 billion a year to our kids and our grandchildren. We're going to come up and pay for it now. I didn't hear my friend from Oklahoma raise that issue. And I hear other people coming to the floor and they say, well, we have a tremendous national debt, and we have pictures of the kids, and yet they propose to completely eliminate the estate tax, which over a course of 20 years will cause us a loss of $1 trillion. And how is that going to be paid for? Oh, I guess we don't have to pay for it. I guess we could just pass that on to the kids. So I think that some of our friends who talk about fiscal responsibility might in fact want to pay for this war today, not pass it on to future generations. And when they are talking about giving huge tax breaks to the wealthiest people in this country, let them understand that that's all they are doing is driving up the national debt so that our kids and grandchildren will be forced to pay for that. Mr. President, we are in the midst of a debate about the budget. And as you know, a budget is a lot more than just numbers. It reflects the values and the priorities of our nation. And when we look at what is going on in this country, as important as a $9.2 trillion national debt is, it is not the only issue out there of importance. What is also important is to understand today what is going on in terms of the needs and the lives of middle class and working people. One of the realities that we do not talk about very much today is that poverty in America is increasing, and in fact, since President Bush has been in office, almost 5 million more Americans have joined the ranks of the poor. That's part of the Bush economy. We now have almost 36.5 million Americans who are living in poverty. And many of these people are working, and they're working 40 or 50 hours a week, but they're making $8 an hour, they're making $7 an hour, and they are just not making enough money in order to lift themselves out of poverty. In fact, the United States of America today has the highest rate of poverty of any major nation on earth, and that is an issue that we should address here in the Senate. And when we are talking about Americans living in poverty, we're not, of course, just talking about adults. Tragically, we are also talking about children. And I know that our president and many others talk about family values. Well, this is not a family value. Under President Bush's administration, since he's been in office, 1.2 million more children are now living in poverty, and we have almost 13 million kids in this country who live in poverty. That is not a family value. That is a national disgrace. Mr. President, as a matter of fact, the United States has the dubious distinction of having the highest childhood poverty rate in the industrialized world. I hear some of my friends coming to the floor to compare this or that aspect of American society or our tax policy with Europe and other countries. Well, I think it's important that we look at this chart, how we treat our children. What this chart shows is that Finland, Norway, and Sweden all have childhood poverty rates of less than 5%. Switzerland, Belgium, Austria, France, Denmark, and Germany all have childhood poverty rates of less than 10%. The Netherlands has a childhood poverty rate of slightly more than 10%, but in the United States of America, the childhood poverty rate is 21.9%, or more than double that of France, Germany, Austria, or the Netherlands. Now, why is that an important fact? It's important, obviously, that the children are vulnerable, that as adults we are responsible for the children and we are failing those children. But it is also important to note that we have, as a nation, more people behind bars, incarcerated, than any other nation on earth, including China. And if anyone thinks there is not a direct correlation between high poverty rates for kids who mentally drop out of society, get involved in self-destructive activity at young ages, and then end up in jail, you would be kidding yourselves. And the issue here is whether we address this crisis of 21% of our kids living in poverty, whether we provide for those kids, or 15 or 18 or 20 years later, whether we lock them up at $50,000 a pop. Mr. President, there has been recent discussion about the economy, whether we're in a recession, entering a recession, but the truth of the matter is, despite President Bush's assertions, this economy has been a disaster for middle-income and working families from day one. Since President Bush took office in 2001, median household income for working-age Americans has declined by almost $2,500. That is what we call the collapse of the middle class. Over 8.5 million Americans have lost their health insurance. That is what we call the disintegration of the healthcare system in America. 3 million workers have lost their pensions. And the idea of a defined pension program is increasingly becoming ancient history. More and more workers are wondering what is going to happen to them when they retire, and the idea that there will really be a defined pension program for them when they retire, that is not something that most workers, especially younger workers, believe. Mr. President, the annual trade deficit since President Bush has been in office has more than doubled, and over 3 million good-paying manufacturing jobs have been lost. The price of gas at the pump and home heating oil has more than doubled, while ExxonMobil made $40 billion in profits last year, more than any company in the history of the world. $3.20 for a gallon of gas that working people in Vermont can't afford, because workers in Vermont often travel long distance to and from work. $40 billion in profit for ExxonMobil. Home foreclosures, of course, are now the highest on record. Meanwhile, while the middle class is shrinking and poverty is increasing, the wealthiest people in this country have never had it so good since the 1920s. My friend from Oklahoma mentioned that there are issues that we just don't talk about, and he has a point. But one of the issues that we don't talk about in this body, for pretty obvious reasons to my mind, because who pays for the campaigns around here, is the growing disparity, the outrageous disparity of income and wealth in this country. Mr. President, what this chart shows is that the wealthiest 1% of the population now owns 34% of the nation's wealth, while the bottom 90% owns only 29% of our wealth. That's here. So what you see is the richest 1% own more wealth than the bottom 90%. Is that what America is supposed to be about? Is that the kind of society that we want? There's a lot of discussion that takes place here on the floor of the Senate, in the House, about the economy. But at the end of the day, when you look at the economy, what's important, most important, is not just economic growth, not just GDP. What really is most important is what is happening to the average person. You can have all the growth you want, and you can see ordinary working people experiencing a decline in their real wages. You can see a lot of wealth being created, but it doesn't mean a whole lot to ordinary people if most of that income and wealth is going to the people on top. The bottom line is that in the economy, there are winners and losers. And it is very clear that in the economy today, the middle class is losing, lower income people are being decimated, while the upper income people have never had it so good. And I know that my friends here in the Senate on both sides of the aisle, and I speak as an independent, hesitate to talk about that issue. But it is imperative that we do talk about it. Mr. President, let me go to another chart. And this chart talks about the economy in terms of how different groups are doing. And this chart shows that the wealthiest 1% saw its total income rise by $180,000 in 2005, or more than what the average middle-class family makes in 3 years. This is the rise in income, not what they make. This is just their increase. So the wealthiest 1% are doing phenomenally well. That's on average. That's a pretty good year, on average, seeing an increase of $180,000 in the year 2005. This is according to the Congressional Budget Office. Meanwhile, the average middle-class family received a $400, that's the small little box down here, increase in annual income in 2005. CBO also found that the total share of after-tax income going to the top 1% hit the highest level on record, while the middle class and working families received the smallest share of after-tax income on record. So when people understand in their gut that what's happening is the middle class is shrinking and the rich are getting richer, well, this is what it is about. That's the fact. And that is precisely what's happening in America. In addition, according to Forbes magazine, the collective net worth of the wealthiest 400 Americans, that's not a lot of people, increased by $290 billion last year. Increased by $290 billion to a total of $1.5 trillion. Wealthiest 400 families. Not only are the richest 400 Americans seeing a vast increase in their wealth, their combined income has more than doubled from 2002 to 2005. At the same time, the average income paid by the wealthiest 400 Americans has fallen from 30% to 18%. And that's not Bernie Sanders. That's according to the Wall Street Journal. And the reason why the average income tax for the wealthiest people who are making astronomical sums of money, why that has almost been cut in half, is mainly due to Bush's tax cuts, according to the Wall Street Journal. The middle class is shrinking, poverty is increasing, and the wealthiest people have not had it so good since the 1920s, and that is an overview of the state of our economy. Now, why do I raise these issues? I raise these issues because if we truly do not understand what is going on around our country to the lives of ordinary people, people who can't afford to fill up their gas tank, can't afford college education for their kids, can't afford child care, can't afford to take care of their parents. If we don't understand that reality, it's pretty hard for this body to make good public policy. The question then is, what do we do? What do we do? Well, President Bush gave us his answer in his budget. And what President Bush in his budget said is, at a time when the richest people in America are becoming richer, what should we do? Well, let's give them even more tax breaks. That makes a lot of sense to the richest people in America and George W. Bush. And what did he say to the poorest people in America? Well, poverty is increasing. There's a level of desperation going on in this country that we have not seen for many years. So at a time when poverty is increasing, what do? Well, according to George W. Bush, you cut back on the needs and programs that help low-income and middle-income people. And that is precisely what Bush's budget was about, one of the more absurd documents that I've ever seen in my life. Fortunately, that budget has been placed where it belongs, and that is in the garbage can, and we are now debating a much different budget, and a budget that is far better. Mr. President, the budget that we have before us, and I'm proud to be a member of the Budget Committee working with Chairman Conrad, is far, far, far better than the President's budget. But in my view, we can make improvements on it. We can do better than the budget that we are now debating. And to that regard, I will be introducing an amendment, and I want to thank the presiding officer for being one of the co-sponsors of that amendment. And let me just very briefly talk about that. Mr. President, it seems to me as we look at some of the trends that we should be addressing in this budget, at least three come to mind. Number one is the middle class is declining. Number two is that our children are suffering. And number three is that we have, among other things, a major infrastructural crisis in this country. And it is my view that we need a budget which will address some of those issues. And I'm very proud that I will soon be introducing an amendment which is being co-sponsored by Senators Clinton, Senators Durbin, Senator Kennedy, Senator Harkin, Senator Schumer, Senator Mikulski, and Senator Brown, who is presiding. And this amendment, Mr. President, is a pretty simple one. It puts the needs of our children, it puts the needs of our working families and persons with disabilities and senior citizens ahead of the wealthy few. It really, at a time when our presidential candidates from both parties are talking about change, change, and change, at a time when the American people overwhelmingly understand that it is imperative that we move this country in a different direction, this amendment can begin the process of change right here in the Senate and, in fact, changing our national priorities. And the choice that the Senate will have in terms of this amendment is a pretty simple one, is do we continue to give tax breaks to the very wealthiest people in this country, people who have never had it so good, Or do we invest in our children, our working families, and those people who are in need? Very specifically, what this amendment would do is restore the top income tax bracket to 39.6% for households earning more than $1 million per year. Those are the only people who would be affected. And we would use that revenue to begin to address some of the most urgent unmet needs of our children. We would address the issue of job creation. We would address the issue of deficit reduction. Mr. President, 99.7% of Americans would not be impacted by this tax change. Only the top 0.3% would see their income tax rates go back to where they were during the Clinton administration, when few would deny that the economy was far stronger than it currently is. According to the Joint Tax Committee, restoring the top income tax bracket for people making more than $1 million to what it was in 2000 would increase revenue by about $32.5 billion over the next 3 years, including $10.8 billion in fiscal year 2009 alone. So, here's the choice. We can continue over a 3-year period to give $32.5 billion in tax breaks to the top 0.3%, people who economically today are doing phenomenally well, or we can invest it in the people in our country and use some of that for deficit reduction. What could we do with $32.5 billion? Well, let me tell you. We could, as our amendment does, expend $10 billion for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That is special education. Mr. President, over 30 years ago, the federal government made a promise that it would fund 40% of the cost of special education. Unfortunately, today we only spend about 17% of the cost of special ed. I know in Vermont, I don't know about Ohio, but I can tell you that in Vermont, in school district after school district, property taxes are going up, and one of the reasons is the very high cost of special ed. So you're seeing more and more kids coming into the system who have special ed needs. Educating those kids is very expensive. The federal government has not kept its promise in adequately funding special ed, so it is the local tax base, local property tax payers who have to pick up the cost. By putting $10 billion more into special ed, not only can we help people stabilize their property taxes, but we can pay more attention to the kids with special ed needs, and both of those goals, to my mind, are goals that we should strive for. This amendment would also increase Head Start funding by $5 billion over the next 3 years. Mr. President, after adjusting for inflation, Head Start has been cut by over 11% compared to fiscal year 2002. Meanwhile, less than half of all eligible children are enrolled in Head Start, and only about 3% of eligible children are enrolled in early Head Start. And this amendment would begin to correct this situation. What Head Start is about is what its title indicates. What we have known for a very long time is the most important intellectual and emotional years of a human being's life are their earliest years. And if kids are not exposed to books, and they're not exposed to ideas, and they're not learning how to socialize, and they don't have good emotional development, those kids are going to go off in a bad direction. And what Head Start was about, and what Head Start has been successful about, is giving kids the opportunity so that when they get into kindergarten and first grade, that those kids will then be in a position by which they can learn effectively and can socialize well with their peers. Head Start works. The problem right now is that it is inadequately funded, and millions of families simply cannot get into this very good program. Now, in addition to funding special education and Head Start, my amendment would also provide a $4 billion increase for the Child Care Development Block Grant. One of the issues that we very rarely discuss here in the Senate but that every working family with young children knows is a major, major crisis in America, is the lack of availability of child care, affordable quality child care. How many millions of kids are now being minded by untrained people and stuck in front of television sets for 8 hours a day? And what an unfortunate circumstance that is. Our little kids, especially at a time when most women work, are entitled to good quality child care, and this amendment would provide funding to help do that. This amendment would also provide $3.5 billion increase to the food stamp program. Hunger in America, I know you know, Mr. President, because you and I are working on an issue to address this. Hunger in America is increasing. Food shelves are running out of food. That should not be taking place in this country. So what we do here is add $3.5 billion more for the food stamp program. In my state of Vermont, it gets pretty cold, and that's true in many other states. Meanwhile, with the price of home heating oil soaring, you have many, many people who are having a difficult time paying their heating bills. This amendment would increase the very successful low-income home energy assistance program, often called LIHEAP, by $4 billion. Bottom line here is nobody in America should go cold in the winter. Furthermore, this amendment would provide $3 billion for school construction. There are kids who are going to schools that are outmoded, they are decrepit, they are not energy efficient. We can create a lot of good jobs. We can improve the quality of education by building modern schools and upgrading the schools that currently exist. We put $3 billion into that. And finally, Mr. President, at a time of record-breaking deficits, this amendment would reduce the deficit by $3 billion. I'm very happy to inform you, Mr. President, that this amendment has been endorsed by over 50 groups, including the AFL-CIO, AFSCME, the National Education Association, Children's Defense Fund, the American Federation of Teachers, East the Seals, the YWCA, the National Head Start Association, the SEIU, and the National Organization for Women. And let me just quote from a letter that I received from all of these groups, and I quote, "The economic downturn is creating a crisis for parents who work hard but struggle to afford nutritious meals as food prices escalate, to pay for energy for their homes and fuel for their cars, to pay for child care so that they can work, and to assure that their young children receive the building blocks of a solid education to prepare them for the future. Programs that assist in meeting these needs have been cut significantly in recent years, while tax breaks for millionaires have soared. My amendment addresses these needs. We are urging the Senate to adopt your fiscally responsible amendment to address the pressing needs of working families while restoring greater progressivity to the tax system." Mr. President, the choice is clear. We can provide $32.5 billion in tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires who don't need it, or we can begin to meet the unmet needs of our children. That is what this amendment is about, and I look forward to the support of my